If you want to bust the myth on how you can be a Christian and also believe in scientific theories, this is the video for you. So today we want to talk about a very exciting topic and one near and dear to my heart, which is Christianity and science. And the myth we want to bust today is that there isn't a need to select one scientific theory in order to be a good Christian. The one topic that comes up most pervasively for us as Christians is this idea that in order to be a good Christian, you have to be a young earth creationist, which seems to counter the idea that you have to be, in order to be a good scientist, you have to be further along on the spectrum and more towards the evolution side. And so the intent of this video is to not answer that specific question necessarily, but give you a much broader and more useful framework to not only answer this kind of question, but many others that we as scientists and Christians face in the real world, so that you can use this framework to have the discussion and dialogue, but also for you yourself to think through the different positions you can take and be a strong believer in Christ while still functioning well in a secular world that has potentially some different ideas. There's two concepts I want to share with you. So the first is the concept of the oscillation in thinking that happens between religion and science. So if you were to imagine or think about time along the bottom axis of a chart and the variability that happens in thinking across religion, what you'll find is over time, religion, whether that's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or other established religions, the variance that happens a long time in the thinking and the evolution that happens a long time in the thinking is relatively minimal. So over time, while there are changes that happen, the core value system of those religions don't vary that much. Now, if you counter that to science, you definitely see variations and you see oscillations within over time in the thinking that happens. So Newtonian theory was held as really critical and important, and for a long time was held as a key part of what scientists believed. Well, fast forward a little bit and you've got Einstein. And what they discovered was, while Newtonian theories and concepts hold true in most situations, there are situations where there's relativity. And Einstein described his theory of relativity, which said that in certain situations, Newton's theories don't hold true. And that, there's certain gravitational forces that affect time. And while Newton talked about space and time being two independent dynamics, Einstein combined them and said space-time is a combined dynamic. And so, we had this evolution in the thinking in scientific theory. And now you fast forward even further and you've got kind of what's called string theory. And even we know that Einstein's theories don't hold up in certain situations, like when you're thinking about the work that Stephen Hawking's done or others have done around black holes. So in a relatively brief period of time in science, you've gone from a fundamental belief that space and time are different to a belief that, hey, there is relativity here and that, there's space and time could be more integrated than we think, to now, even in certain situations, there may be something different. So I give you that as an example to say, in a relatively brief period of time, you're seeing shifts in the fundamental thinking of science. So that's the example of saying religion, relatively static, not that it doesn't oscillate that much in the thinking, and science, which by definition changes and evolves, and there is a variability in thinking, so much more dynamic in the thinking. The second idea is that in the past, there was a huge integration in art, science, math, architecture, and many other things between religion and those disciplines. So if you go back, and it's not peculiar to Christianity, you find this in Islam or Hinduism, the patrons who were supporting scientific theory or the patrons who are supporting art and other things, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on science. The patrons who supported the science were also affiliated with strong religious beliefs, and so they were supporting those religious beliefs. So if you were to imagine a Venn diagram, what you would find is the worldview between somebody who was a scientist and somebody who was an astute religious believer, whether that was any religion, but let's talk about Christianity for a second here. There was a huge overlap between science and religion. And as we've evolved and as the world has changed, you're seeing a definite separation between those who are sponsoring and are the patrons for science and scientific theory. And so there isn't this need anymore to actually have a huge overlap between science and religion. So you're seeing a separation between science and religion, and the worldviews are more separated. While there may be some parts in the middle that overlap, generally speaking, they're pretty separate. And that's a really key concept for us to acknowledge and understand. So to illustrate this example, let's talk about Copernicus. So Ptolemy came up with this idea of geocentricity. That is, that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything else revolves around it. And there was a lot of belief in that system for a long period of time, supported by the church. It wasn't that the church believed it, but because this theory was out there, there was verses that were being used to support that theory. Now, Copernicus came along and he made some observations where there was a realization that actually the Earth wasn't the center. It's more likely that the sun was at the center and the Earth revolved around it. Heliocentrism, right? And for a while there was a lot of pushback from the church on that belief. Copernicus's theory wasn't developed only by him. There was several Islamic scholars as well who also kind of started to see this irregularity with Ptolemy's theory about how the Earth was the center and the sun rotated around it. That helped Copernicus make a postulation that, actually the Earth was not of any significance and the sun was more significant and the Earth revolved around it. So that's kind of what we ended up with, was a heliocentric theory. Well, at that time there was a belief in the church because of certain verses that suggested that if you didn't believe in those things, you were a heretic. And other thinkers at the time and other scientists at the time, including Kepler and Galileo, who, while they agreed with Copernicus, they were really struggling with actually going against the patrons who were supporting their work. Galileo, while he was a believer in this, he was very hesitant to be proactive in articulating this heliocentric theory as the theory that people should follow, because there was a high risk of him being viewed as a heretic. Well, fast forward a few years, and what you ended up seeing is Pope Urban the Eighth came to be Pope, and while he didn't believe, he wasn't a heliocentricist, he had a soft spot for Galileo. So Galileo thought this was his opportunity to postulate and support Copernicus. What ended up happening is, while Pope Urban was supportive of Galileo, he wasn't that supportive. And so once this position came out and he published a manuscript on it, there was a huge outcry. And Galileo, what you saw happening was slowly backing down from a position, and the church and the patrons who supported the church, including the Medici and others, were applying a lot of pressure to people, to scientists in that era, to make sure that this Ptolemaic thinking was being held up. So that's a really good example of where, you had this worldview. It was very much supported by patrons and by a religious organization, an institution, and it didn't let the science evolve. And so the second concept that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is science and religion, or science and the institution of religion, Christianity and Islam and other things, don't necessarily dictate today what they used to in the past. So you are going to see a bifurcation or a difference between what's being articulated in scientific circles and what could potentially be being articulated by religious leaders in whatever form, whether it's Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, or others. So the first concept is, remember that science by almost its nature is going to oscillate and change over time. As we learn more things are going to change, where religion is going to be relatively static. And there's going to be times as religion oscillates through that science and religion come close together. And there's going to be times where there's commonality and there's other times where there's not going to be. So that's the first concept. The second concept is because science was being supported and other arts and disciplines are being supported by religious organizations in the past and not so much today, you are going to see a difference and a dispersion of those ideas and not necessarily a clean overlap between those worldviews. So now that we've talked about those two concepts, let's think about exactly what that means and how we can apply them. So the first thing to really recognize as Christians and as Christians who are scientists or Christians who are functioning in a secular world is that the gospel message is unaffected no matter what position we take along the scientific spectrum. We have to believe that man was separated from God. God loved us. He came down, sent his son to die for our sins, rose from the dead, and is now in heaven. And I think that concept, regardless of where you stand on the multiple different things about scientific theories, whether that's evolution, creation, whether that's an expanding universe or a contracting universe, whether that's a multiverse or a universe, it doesn't matter and it does not affect that. So I think that's one really important piece for us to first appreciate and understand, is that the gospel message is unaffected regardless of where you stand on these multiple different issues you could face from a secular world. So that's one. The second thing that's really important for us to understand, and goes back to the concept we talked about where religion is more static and science is dynamic. And because of that understanding, we must know that religion cannot chase science. i.e., because there's an evolution in scientific theory, doesn't mean that religion needs to necessarily change and chase that idea or chase that concept. We do know that science will change, and there is going to be times when science comes closer to religion and potentially completely overlaps it, and there's going to be other times where it's completely counter to what the religious position is. And if we continually chase and evolve and don't stand with confidence in this on the religious positions that we believe in, then I think we are opening up the religion to an examination that's more, or should be more, reserved for science rather than a more static idea and static theology like religion. 3, when you decouple religion from science, what that's done is it's allowed the scientific discipline, but many others, art, architecture, and many others, to catalyze their progress at a much more rapid rate. They're not encumbered by one particular worldview, whether that's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or any other form of religion or institution that was holding back the thinking and maintaining within a box the thinking of these different disciplines. It allows the discipline to grow and evolve at a much more rapid pace. Now, what does that mean? That means ideas are going to come out of those disciplines much faster. We are going to need, as practitioners of those disciplines, to be much more engaged, much more in tune with those disciplines to understand exactly how quickly they're progressing. What the current thinking in genetics versus what I studied 20 years ago has evolved so much, and there's so much richness in the science that's out there today that we would do ourselves a disservice if we weren't remaining engaged. So I'll give you a really good illustration of this and how it actually helps us to be engaged in those disciplines and allows us to live our fullest Christian life. If you think about Compton, there were 13 Nobel laureates in physics who were Christians, and Compton was one of them. Compton discovered that photons scattered when they came in contact with a charged particle. Well, everyone's probably looking at this going, great, so what? That important concept that he won the Nobel Prize for along with his colleagues led to significant steps forward in radiation therapy. And that meant that there's a whole host of people whose lives have been saved through the fantastic medicine that's been developed, the therapies that have been developed that have helped individuals battle cancer, survive cancer, and beat cancer. Had Compton taken a hermetic position around Christianity and said, I'm a Christian, there are things in science that I can't wrestle with or can't justify in my Christian worldview, therefore I'm going to walk away from it. It would be a complete disservice. That as a Christian, we should actually be engaged, because that may be the way God uses us to fulfill his mission in this world. So that's the third. So I think it's really important. The three things that we should use as a framework here is: one, the gospel message remains unchanged and is unaffected by whatever position we take, and that's critically important for us. So that gives us the second and third points, which is two, God has given us the permission to examine and understand his beauty, keep up with the latest thinking, knowing that it's going to go back and forth. The human thinking is going to go back and forth. Sometimes it's going to overlap with Christian principles, and other times it's going to be counter to it. But that doesn't mean we run away from it. It's a way for us to enjoy the magnificence of the Creator. And three, it's our mission. God's given each of us talents, that the best way to use your talents, best way to use your skills, be engaged in the discipline God has given you a talent for, use it. And that will be how he uses you to fulfill his mission for your life. Just as Compton was used to help heal so many people, God's going to use you and the work that you're doing. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content thought-provoking and encouraged you to dig back into the scriptures. If so, please subscribe to support the channel.